Hi everyone, it's Ren here. I hope you are doing well, guys. Apologize in advance for my crazy haircut. And I need to look into the camera now because this is what I do these days. So, before I move on to my topic, keep in mind that I have written a book on the INFJ personality, the Ecstatic Soul. Deepest investigation of the INFJ you'll find online. If you want to go deep, it doesn't get deeper than this. Less than $10, available on all the Amazon websites. All the links are available below. And look at this cover. I mean, is this you? This is what you have to figure out. Is this you? I hope it's me anyway. So, today I wanted to talk a little bit more about the what you could describe as the current state of crisis in the personality community. Now, you might not agree with me that there is a state of crisis, but perhaps if we refine the terms a little bit further, you'll understand what I mean by this, and I think that there is a chance that you would realize that after all, perhaps you do agree. Now, so far I've only said this, that there is a state of crisis in the personality community, typology community, same thing, two interchangeable terms. So first, in order for something to be in crisis, there needs to be something which is capable of falling into crisis. So is the scientific, or I should say the personality community, really this? Is it a community? Or is it just an atomized collection of discrete sub-communities? So you'd have the overwhelmingly major community of people who have an interest in MBTI, full stop, as a sort of a simplification and in some respects elaboration of Jung and the Jungian cognitive functions. So you could refer to this subcommunity, which is really the dominant community, as JCF. This is referred to in some circles. So that would be Jungian cognitive functions. You have the personality communities, such as the communities that gravitate around C.S. Joseph, Eric Thor, Michael Pierce, cognitive type. There is CPT, cognitive personality theory. There is rational typology, I believe, and there's a bunch of other ones. So there's all these different communities, and they're communities of various sizes. And it seems to me that the more specific they are, the more, not necessarily the smaller, but the more sort of demarcated they tend to be. And so what you have, as the kind of dominant community, the JCF community, is probably the one that is the least aware of itself as a community because it is so large and so amorphous. I suppose you could even argue that there's a certain type of community around my channel. I would like to think of it as the Jungian existentialist community, and there's a few certified Jungian existentialists among us, also known as my Patreon followers and supporters, whom I thank dearly, and remind you that there is a link down below where you can choose to support me also on Patreon. But insofar as there's no Discord for my community, Discord is a really great way to formalize, right? It's a tool to formalize a community and give it a specific identity. Nevertheless, I think that it can safely be said that insofar as the same people tend to go to the same resources within the niche of personality theory, there is a community writ large. There is a community that encompasses all the other communities. And so that in this sense, it can be defensively argued that anyone who has an interest, a sustained interest, not just a passing interest, you join a new job and you take a test and you're like, oh cool, I'm the champion or whatever. Someone who actually takes a sustained and somewhat consistent interest in personality and reads up resources on the Jungian cognitive function, so on, is part of that community. And I think that over time, as this is the sort of sustaining of the engagement gets I suppose becomes more pronounced, people tend to identify with that community. They start recognizing that there are people who have the same interests and that they exchange with these people. There's also forums, INFJ forum, there's the personality database website, so many communities. So when I say that it is in crisis, or when I submit the hypothesis that it is in crisis, it is because it seems to me that the disagreements that are everyday noticeable in that world stem not necessarily always from carefully thought through positions that turn out to be incompatible, as would be the case in a community that is, well, first of all, that is scientific, at least in the sense that it's seeking truth about a particular domain of research through objective methods, but also in the sense that in a community that's not in crisis, you'd have disagreements on the basis of fairly shared premises that are recognized and correctly interpreted as shared premises. And the problem with the personality community, as opposed to other types of scientific communities that are not in crisis, and you can take as examples, the community, and this might seem like a bit of a stretch, but I think that this is perfectly okay. Communities within the Darwinian paradigm that accept the basic premises of the Darwinian theory. In physics, communities, that are organized around the two main paradigms of quantum physics and general relativity, sharing the premises. In the personality community, the premises are not shared. I think that often the premises are thought to be shared, but they are not shared. And in one of the ways in which you can observe that is by paying attention to how people are talking and how they're manipulating words and discourse. And you start realizing that people operate with different meanings of basic terms. So it seems that for a particular kind of subcommunity, the cognitive functions mean certain things, and they are to be observed in terms of what people do or in what people are interested in. And for another community, those cognitive functions are to be interpreted in terms of what people say and the structure of how they speak. And for other communities, the cognitive functions might be primarily identified and observed in terms of their body language, in terms of their micro-expressions, in terms of their physical energetics. So that would be closer to, or precisely, the cognitive type approach. And you have other communities where it seems that the cognitive functions, and that's probably applicable to this more amorphous JCF community, the one that is not even aware that it is a community in some sense. Well, here it seems that the definitions of the cognitive functions are often purely based on the members' subjective interpretations of what they read about the cognitive functions. So the descriptions that they read online are then mediated through their interpretation, and that's okay as such as a first step, because the mediation of subjective interpretation is unavoidable. But it stops there, and it doesn't pursue the path of inquiry toward achieving a more objective understanding. So given that there is not agreement among those different meanings assigned to various basic concepts, and I've been focusing on the meaning of cognitive functions because it seems to me that that's the easiest to talk about, and that's, those are really some of the core concepts. But you could push that further and look at concept of introversion and extroversion. That's also not agreed. The basic premises in relation to extroversion and introversion are really not achieving consensus across the different communities. Again, in the broad JCF community, it's a matter of really how you are with other people, whether you like to spend time mostly on your own or socially. It's sometimes defined in somewhat not as clear as one might think terms as where you get your energy, whether you get energized from being alone and spend it with people, or the reverse. And then you have different interpretations of introversion and extroversion. And again, a cognitive type would be one that has an interesting, and it seems to me, a more rigorous one, where it basically says whatever your dominant energetic in terms of your body signals and language is, well, that's assigned to a function. If that function is extroverted, you're an extrovert. If that function is introverted, you're an introvert. And as to the answer, yeah, but I spend time on my own or whatever, I prefer to spend time on my own rather than with other people. Well, I think the typical cognitive type answer would be, well, you are cognitively extroverted. That doesn't mean that you're socially extroverted. Cognitively extroverted is this very specific definition in terms of your energetics, in terms of your signals. Social introversion, extroversion is a less rigorous, slightly more lax kind of common sense sort of term for people describing, how social, how outgoing they are, how they like to be in the presence of other people, and so on. So a perfectly okay definition of extroversion, but not a scientific one in this sense, not a rigorously analyzed one. It's okay, it's just a different discourse. So in the sense, I think that cognitive type is quite consistent, and probably more so than other frameworks. But you can really apply that to pretty much everything. Disagreements as to whether the shadow functions 5 to 8 are meaningful at all. Some models incorporate them, some models don't. As you probably already know, my position is that they should rather not be included, because they tend to make testing meaningless, because a theory that has the 8 functions integrated within its model is always going to come out true in some sense or another. I'm not going to repeat, the reason why, because I think that I've talked about that for a long time, and you're probably familiar with my reasoning at this point. So crisis in this sense. Now, according to some philosophers of science, particularly Thomas Kuhn in his book Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and other books and other essays, there is a certain biological evolution to a paradigm that's in crisis. So if you take the paradigm to be the Jungian paradigm of personality, the symptoms that the paradigm is in crisis is this growing impossibility to come to terms with agreed upon basic meanings. I'm not talking about definitions, because agreeing upon basic definitions is useful when you're engaged in conversation and within a scholarly community. But definitions are in some sense conventional and arbitrary, but they're conventional. People deliberately agree upon them. meanings are things that are more integrated unconsciously over time. So you integrate the meanings of the Jungian paradigm, but it just seems that the meanings are more and more exploded these days. And I think that's one of the hypotheses that we could formulate in relation to why that happens, is that people start taking the meanings that they find most useful, because the problems that keep cropping up in the study of personality are actually less and less turn out to be, as the community becomes more numerous, more equipped to observe and to share experiences, because the field in itself is gathering more and more interest. The problems just don't seem to be easy to manage and answer. In other words, the puzzles don't seem as easy to solve within this old Jungian paradigm. And that's why we get to see lots of heterodox approaches that end up being embraced by a number of people, and that creates the sub-communities that then become silos and stop communicating with other communities, partly because they're competitors, and we also know that there are business practices associated with these communities, and so there's a reason for wanting to be the most popular, wanting to beat the competition, and not wanting to be falsified. But there's also probably a sense in which there is mutual misfiring of communication, of translation. There's opaque understanding between those different communities over time, because the meanings that they operate with are actually not commonly shared. It's assumed they're shared, but actually they're coming from different directions. And that's a symptom of the explosion of the paradigm that is in crisis, at least according to my vision in this video and according to my hypothesis. So I guess, I've been talking for a while. I would like this video to not last much longer than 20 minutes. So some sort of thoughts about what might happen. Because it seems to me that things cannot just go on like this. There's going to be either a desire toward more unification, which doesn't mean that everybody thinks the same, but at least can agree on basic axioms and meanings. Or disintegration of the paradigm, where the paradigm itself has become meaningless, and there's no substitute paradigm. It just becomes, a matter of like people being interested in that particular side of personality according to that particular model, but they all become these self-subsistent universes that stop communicating altogether. So let's just assume that that's not going to happen. Not that it's completely unlikely, but it's the less interesting outcome for us, and we would rather hope that it doesn't happen. Well, the other alternative is that a new paradigm emerges. A new paradigm emerges to essentially as a substitute for the Jungian paradigm. It doesn't mean that it will be a completely and utterly sort of blank slate. It's not going to be that. It's still going to be very much in the lineage of the Jungian paradigm, but it's going to essentially replace it. Somewhat like, or rather completely like, the Darwinian paradigm replaced other paradigms in biology. And very much like the Einsteinian, or the paradigm of general relativity replaced Newtonian paradigm. Now, does that mean that the Newtonian paradigm was worthless? It's not, and in fact it's still used for certain simple calculations because it's easier to deploy than the paradigm of relativity. But relativity has come into its own. It's the dominant paradigm, and the meanings it ascribes to certain terms, such as gravity, but many other terms, most of the terms probably, are different from the meanings that are used in the Newtonian paradigm. So I think that we have to start thinking in terms of the Jungian paradigm as a Newtonian paradigm, and as the future paradigm that will replace it, hopefully as a result of crisis, as more of an Einsteinian paradigm, at least sort of along those lines of thinking. And for the new paradigm to emerge, what Kuhn suggests is that it's never just coming out of the blue, like in a pure collective intuition where people just one morning all agree among each other, okay, that's the new paradigm and we're going to operate together with this. What usually happens is that one of the theories that is competing in this state of anarchic crisis turns out to be able to solve way many more problems that have been cropping up than other theories. And it tends to be this theory that in the end everybody gravitates towards, and it becomes a new paradigm. And it defines the new meanings of the terms, and then collaboration normal science, problem solving, puzzle solving can continue from within that paradigm. Of course, there can be disagreements, there can be offshoots, there can be heterodox approaches, but in a sense, you have this healthy orthodoxy that constitutes the core. And again, if you think of quantum physics and general relativity, you know, they're both over 100 years old. They're still the paradigms. They're not unhealthy as such. Although it is interesting to point out that even within physics, there will come a point where those frameworks will not be able to solve problems, or the problems that are generated are problems that have already been solved. And so the novelty becomes about how to present your solution rather than bringing forth genuinely novel solutions. And so there will be new paradigms in physics too, in biology, in computer science, you know, in any science whatsoever. I don't want to make any predictions as to which model is going to win, because I'd like to make a video about that in the future. I think it deserves a separate discussion. But I have an idea as to which model I think is the most likely to win. But I'd like to discuss that in the future, like I said, in terms of the opportunities of this model, but also in terms of the challenges, because there are many. And let me know what you think in the video, in the comments of this video, guys. This discussion of the crisis within the personality community. Do you agree? Do you think that I'm overthinking this? Do you find it stimulating? Would you like to contribute anything? Please share. Don't forget that you have my book on the INFJ that you can still purchase, links below, and you can support me on Patreon. All right, enjoy the rest of your weekend, guys, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.